Human rights within environment-related sustainable development goals, or SDGs, are challenged by a gap between commitment from national governments and SDG implementation at the community level. How do we promote diversity and inclusion of all people to implement SDGs that aim to fulfill their rights? How do we ensure that national government commitment to human rights can be experienced at the local level? And how can we ensure that community efforts are supported, not restricted, by national governments? We can provide blended learning and training models on localizing human rights and environment for SDG activities. We can develop and use practical tools to support analysis, participation, and monitoring of SDG implementation. And we can support research, partnerships, and networking for all parties who are interested in human rights and environmental SDGs. These efforts work to achieve the realization of human rights for communities as a result of implementing environmental SDGs at a local level. Human rights within environment-related sustainable development goals, or SDGs, are challenged by a gap between commitment from national governments and SDG implementation at the community level. How do we promote diversity and inclusion of all people to implement SDGs that aim to fulfill their rights? How do we ensure that national government commitment to human rights can be experienced at the local level? And how can we ensure that community efforts are supported, not restricted, by national governments? We can provide blended learning and training models on localizing human rights and environment for SDG activities. We can develop and use practical tools to support analysis, participation, and monitoring of SDG implementation. And we can support research, partnerships, and networking for all parties who are interested in human rights and environmental SDGs. These efforts work to achieve the realization of human rights for communities as a result of implementing environmental SDGs at a local level.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Welcome to the Building Back Better, How Human Rights City Framework Paved the Way, a side event of the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development 2021. This side event is organized by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's Regional Asia Pacific Program. My name is Windy. I'm the Program Officer for Inclusive Society at the Regional Asia Pacific Program based in Jakarta. And I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we start our event today, I would like to express our sincere thanks to our panelists and to you for taking the time to join our event today. To our partner, UCLG ASPAC, for their support in promoting this event. To start, allow me to give a brief introduction to RWI Regional Asia Pacific Program and to our event today. RWI is a research and academic institution with offices, programs, and convening power covering 40 countries. Our mission is to contribute to a wider understanding of and respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. Our work in the Regional Asia Pacific Program covers 4 work streams: people on the move, inclusive society, fair and effective justice, and economic globalization and human rights. Specifically in the area of inclusive society, we are working with local government, academia, NHRIs, and local stakeholders to localize human rights and SDGs through studies, blended learning courses for local government and stakeholders, and development of a handbook to localize human rights, gender equality, and environment in the context of SDGs, among others. For more information about the Regional Asia Pacific Program, please visit our website at rwi.or.id and our HQ's website at rwi.lu.se. and our social media channels, one of which is our Instagram account at RWI_Jakarta. Today's event is also streamed live through our YouTube channel, RWI Jakarta. The idea for today's event stemmed from the fact that over 90% of COVID-19 cases occurring in urban areas. This has not only exposed the risk of the existing inequality in our cities, ranging from unequal access to basic services, including housing, education, and health, but also exacerbated them. The rising inequality and exclusion of vulnerable communities also poses risks to the achievement of SDGs, particularly goal number 10. Continued inequality and exclusion render the poorest and the vulnerable communities more vulnerable to future disasters and health crises. Therefore, building back better should also encompass building back more equal. Through this event, we would like to explore how human rights cities framework could help cities in building back more equal. There are a few interesting international frameworks on human rights city. For instance, the European Charter for Safeguarding of Human Rights in the City and the Global Charter Agenda for Human Rights in the City. The UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee's 2015 report on the role of local government in the promotion and protection of human rights has strengthened the position of local government in protection and realization of human rights. In the context of Asia Pacific, we have the 2011 Guangzhou Declaration on Human Rights City, which defines a human rights city as both a local community and a socio-political process in the local context where human rights play a key role as a fundamental value and a set of guiding principles. Guangzhou's 10 guiding principles recognize human rights city as a framework to cultivate an inclusive and equitable city based on human rights standards. In today's event, we would like to listen to experiences, challenges, and lessons learned in building back equally from cities' perspectives and explore how human rights-based approach can provide cities with a practical analytic framework to build back more equal. We have here today with us three panelists. First, Dr. Bernadia Irawati Tjandradewi, the Secretary General of the United Cities and Local Government Asia Pacific. UCLG ASPAC is one of the regional sections of UCLG. The Asia Pacific region is the biggest of the regional section in UCLG, with linkages to more than 7,000 local governments. UCLG ASPAC is the key knowledge management hub on local government issues in the Asia Pacific region. RWI and UCLG ASPAC have been, for the last 2 years, conducted blended learning courses on localizing human rights in the SDG processes. Second, we have Ichal Supriadi from Asia Democracy Network, or ADN. Another RWI's partner, ADN is a regional network of independent CSOs engaged in democracy promotion and committed to the full realization of democratic and human rights principles, as well as the vision and mission articulated in the Charter of Principles. Third, we have Dr. Matthew Scott, Senior Researcher, Head of People on the Move Thematic Areas from RWI's headquarters in Lund, Sweden. One of Matt's latest work, titled Pandemic Preparedness and Response, National COVID-19 Law and Policy in Human Rights Perspectives, identifies areas of concern, as well as promising practices from the 14 countries, and also sketched a forward-looking rights-based pandemic preparedness and response agenda linked to the post-2015 international frameworks. Also with us today is Mr. Fami Hidayat, Head of Planning Evaluation and R&D Department and Coordinator of SDG Center and Human Rights City Task Force from Wonosobo, Indonesia. Mr. Fahmi, an alumni of our blended learning course in 2020, will share Wonosobo's experience in addressing challenges brought by COVID-19. Before we start, just a few housekeeping announcements. Panelists, please be mindful of the allocated time, as we aim to save as much time possible for Q&A session. Q&A session for session 1 will be taking place right after Mr. Fahmi's 10 minutes sharing session, as Dr. Berna have other appointment to attend to. After session 3, we will have 40 minutes discussion where participants can share their experience and view on how COVID-19 impacted vulnerable communities in our cities and how human rights-based approach means to local government in addressing the impact of COVID-19 to vulnerable communities. You may post your questions or comments on the Q&A box, and we will try our best to address as many questions as possible. Without further ado, let us start with the first session. Human Rights City Framework and Building Back More Equally City Experience with Dr. Bernadia and followed up by Mr. Fami Hidayat. You'll have 10 minutes each. Dr. Bernadia, the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Mbak Windy. Please stop me if I speak much longer than the time given. Very good afternoon, very good morning, dear panelists, dear participants. Greetings from City Hall of Jakarta, Indonesia. I think the first thing that we always should speak about is we should feel blessed that we are given still a good life until today when there is a pandemic. Second, I also would like to thanks RWI for a very, I don't say good cooperation, excellent excellent cooperation of in the past years of introducing this concept of human rights cities among local governments in the Asia Pacific regions. Because through the blended learning courses, we found out that many local governments still found new on this issue, although they have been doing it on daily basis. But then through these blended learning courses, they found out that, oh, this is what it means by human rights cities. This open mind, open also the door for further actions from local government's perspective. So let me share with you. The first one is about maybe before I share what the local governments have been doing during this COVID-19 pandemic, looking at the human rights perspective, let me also give you the 5 visions that I have here. And this is very much related to the COVID-19 and as well as the human rights perspective. And then I will go further of some examples that we have been doing. So the first, I call it 5-0 visions. That the first is first zero is the zero inequalities. Because I envision a human-oriented Asia-Pacific that considers the rights of all. This include women, children, and youth. And the second zero is a zero poverty, a society where everyone has a home and food on their tables. And this is something that all we want. And we have to make sure that no one lives in slum. And the third zero is a zero crime, violence, disaster, and accidents. We want a safe environment, especially for women, children, and less privileged people, free from conflict and disaster risk, because we all want peace and stability. While the fourth zero is zero greenhouse gas emissions and zero pollution, because we know that every human being, in fact, every living being in this planet has the right to breathe a clean air, drink clean water, and live in clean environment. The last zero is about zero intolerance and zero discrimination. Even with different faiths and beliefs, we must show respect and to earn respect. So because all are equal human beings. When we talk about the COVID-19, I will just jump to slide number 5. Because I think everyone is clear with the concepts of human rights cities. I don't know who's going to operate my slide. I thought Ella is going to operate my slide. Anyway, maybe she's still doing it. Okay. So yeah. So cities are the epicenter of COVID-19 pandemic. It have the pandemic itself is impacting millions of people in this world, not only on the social economic impacts, but also having environmental quality as well as management and governance and transportation and urban design. What is quite interesting to show here is that if you understand the Chinese letters, the word crisis, crisis has 2 letters, means danger, another one is opportunity. So hello, can we go to the next slide, please? So in this crisis, there is opportunity. So can we go to next slide, please? Yes. No. Yes. Next. Yeah. So because I'm giving only 10 minutes. So in this crisis, there is always opportunity, and we see quite clear there is a transformations of the way people live and the way people work, and also this is why this is quite relevant also to equality per se, especially if we see this as good opportunity. So often the past year when the COVID-19 started, we advancing UCLG ASPAC as a knowledge hub by generating knowledge, documents smart practices, and facilitates dialogues among local governments as well as central governments and different stakeholders to foster exchange of innovation in handling and recovering from COVID-19. So we share also a guideline what local governments need to know. This is the beginning, just quickly, first month after COVID started. And we're looking at different sectors, including data synchronization, because when we see about different kind of gaps in terms of social safety net programs, for example, the key aspect is about data synchronization that we find challenging in many local areas, especially since several people also lost jobs, and this is it was not recorded initially. So this we had done quickly on the data synchronization, including the local data and national data synchronization through this webinar. The next one. So these are several kind of opportunities that we see in the sector of transportations. For example, there is also shifting in the use of transportation modes, because as you know, in Asian cities, most of the streets are dominated by cars. So we see that more and more demands have been increasing on the bicycles, like Metro Manila is building longest bicycle networks. Also Jakarta, if you live in Jakarta, you see also several, the longest bicycle lanes that they have ever had. So this is, I think, a good opportunity. And then of course, bicycles, everybody can use it, and this is, I see as a shifting in terms of living and then working style of the people. Next, so this is just one example of post-disasters and COVID-19 recovery initiative. I think in the human rights perspective, it's very important that disaster reduction has been put as a priority, and we know that disasters do not choose whatever race we have, whatever gender we have. This is what the activities that we have, and we supporting Palu City and focusing on the recovery phases, such as providing a good learning, building public facility, and supporting local economic development, especially for women. So this has been done also as part of the COVID-19 recovery initiatives, and it will continue to strengthen the small medium enterprises assistance, because local economic aspect is hit quite a lot, especially in the tourism sector. So next in this, so UCLG as a world have been collecting more than 600 initiatives worldwide, and this is available in our web, in the Metropolis and UCLG website. This connecting also not only on the responding to COVID, but also in having recovery plans. So we come up with a 10 decalogues. This maybe I don't need to explain all of them, but we can go back again for the discussions. The important is having multilateralism and also having, and this is also very clear with the human rights concepts, because access to public services, access for all, and as well as having new citizenship and freedom for renewed democracy. So next, I think this is last slide. Next slide. So for the recommendations in mid to long-term recovery, because it's very important that inclusiveness is a key, as well as cross-cutting governance, policy measures, and investment in cities that are grounded in the commitment to sustainability. So we have been combining this localization of SDGs with the COVID-19 impact recovery. So it's not only for key economic infrastructure areas such as transport, energy, telecommunication, but also help fighting this COVID to pursue a sustainable development and address the climate change. So examples like promoting Jeju tourism in the post-COVID-19 era, having a safe tourism system, having also subsidy programs for small, medium enterprises. So this is just one of few examples that the local governments have been doing during this COVID-19 pandemic. Next, I think this is my last slides. We need definitely collaborative actions of local governments in building back better, because we see again, despite there is crisis, but we always see a good opportunity here, because several local governments also have been shifting into digitalized system that also help supporting the supply chains, connecting this supply and buyers through digital network. And this is very, very much relevant also to the situations because when we look at the data itself, less than 10% of small medium enterprises, for instance, for example, in Indonesia, has been connected to a digital platform. So we see this as an opportunity. So we local governments have a commitment. We see this again give us the opportunity to rethink and transform our cities, because we don't want, the cities do not want to go back again to the time before COVID-19. So we always see this as a good opportunity. So we want to use recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phases after disasters to increase the resilience of nations and communities through integrating these disaster risk reduction measures into not only physical infrastructure changes, but also non-infrastructure changes as well. So it's time for solidarity. We see during this COVID-19 the solidarity of local governments, we see is quite clear through this donations from members to other members in terms of mass donations or any other PPEs donations. We see this as solidarity is quite clear, and also see that a lot of methodology like telemedicine has been introduced to the activity. So we are committed. In my conclusion, we all committed, local governments are committed, but we still far from what we see here, because we have still see inequality everywhere. Not because local governments are not really committed about this, but I think the capacity for local government needs to be improved, as well as the access to funding on doing the activities of local governments need to also be enhanced. So overall, we still need to continue the work that we do. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope I speak according to the time given. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you. Terima kasih, Ibu Berna. Let's swiftly move on to our second panelist for the session, Mr. Fami Hidayat from Wonosobo City.
Okay,
Fami?
Thank
Yes,
you very
please.
much, Mbak Windy.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mbak Windy, Mbak Bernadia. Okay. Remind me when I speak more than 10 minutes. Okay, thank you very much, Mbak Bernadia, all panelists and attendees of this meeting, including Martin and Helena in Europe. Probably good morning. Good morning, Europe. Good afternoon from Wonosobo, Indonesia. Okay, I would like to access for me to share my screen, Mbak Windy.
Yes, I believe you already being co-host.
It says host disable participant screen sharing.
Okay, hang on.
Okay. Mbak Wiwi, can you check Pak Fahmi is co-host already or not?
Or Mbak Windy or any other admin can share my presentation. Is okay.
Sure, thank you.
Please, Pak. Thank you. Sorry. You can try now, Pak Fahmi. Can you try to share screen?
Okay.
Thank you, Pak.
Okay. So maybe I would like to share some problem and even challenges that Wonosobo are facing today related to the topic that Wallenberg Institute and UCLG and ADN have discussed today. Yeah, this is a brief situation of Wonosobo. Yeah, we have 15 sub-districts. We have less than 1 million population. Okay, and yeah, this is a context of a so-called Wonosobo human rights cities. We have Perda or regional law in 2016 that all local entities, starting from Bupati or executive and local legislative and other communities, have declared that Wonosobo must respect, protect, and fulfill all the human rights, both in economic and social and culture and civil and political human rights aspects. Yeah, this is another context for us to easily understand the stepping stone of Wonosobo human rights cities since the first chapter by communities in 2015. After we have regional law in 2016, and we have local human rights commissions in 2018. And today we have a new region. Actually, Mr. Afif Nur Hidayat, he is co-declarator of regional law in 2016. At that time, he was the head of local legislative of Wonosobo. So it's like a deja vu for him. Hopefully, this deja vu will be beneficial for the Wonosobo human rights. So this is probably relevant to what Mbak Bernadia shared previously. I would say that all local government have suffered from COVID in various situations. But if we look at the figure, I have consulted with this figure with the PPS, what is it, PPS, the National Statistics Bureau of Indonesia, and the trend of all decline of economic and socio-cultural situation in Indonesia, maybe we can see the trend of the decline from this figure. In the top left, the economic growth is minus, and some expert from Central Java province suggest that in the next year, the governor of Central Java will put the target for economic growth in 3.9. And so many experts say it's not possible, it's impossible. So this is the context to show that the Wonosobo human rights cities are facing the challenges, because if we convert all the figures, for instance, the unemployment rate, the poverty rate, and economic growth, we can simply assume and conclude that the numbers of 70.58% of people living under the poverty line in Indonesia is getting worse today. Yeah, and this is I want to suggest that this issue is highly relevant for the Royal Wallenberg Institute and United City as a local government to help advocate the government of Indonesia because in 2020 and 2020 the last 2 years all regional government have to cut their regional budget. Yeah, we can see that for instance 103 billion rupiah compared to 150 to 300 billion rupiah annual budget. So because I am the head of planning and evaluation program in the regional planning development agency, sometimes when I have to cut this amount of budget, it is a big problem for me to decide which sectors to cut. For instance, if I have to choose to cut the budget for infrastructure or for sanitation or for health or for vaccinations, for instance. So I would like to say that this is the major problems that all regional governments are facing today. Yeah, and probably it is subjective, but we are seeing that today we have the Recentralized Policy of the government of Indonesia. All policy are derived from the Jakarta, and sometimes, for instance, when all region and mayors have to reformulate the regional annual budget, they do not have a proper opportunity to discuss internally, but they have to comply fully with the direction from Jakarta. And the uncertainty of COVID mitigation schemes, because there are too many directions from too many ministries from Jakarta. I sometimes those instruction, those regulations do not comply to each other. Yeah, I would say that advocacy for SDGs in Wonosobo facing the big problem due to budget cut. It is good for me to share the stories about the human rights complaint handling tool, because in my opinion this is the way that the new region can monitor where
Pak Fahmi?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I think I just lost my connection.
Okay. You still have 2 minutes more.
Okay. Yeah. If I have to propose what is highly relevant for Wonosobo to keep our cities more sustainable post-pandemic, I think this is the one that need to be advocated by every parties, including UCLG and Royal Wallenberg Institute and other people proposing a better city and better sustainable city. By this application, the new region, Pak Bupati, can monitor whether all program after pandemic COVID still put the vulnerable groups and marginalized people or not. Yeah, including person with disabilities, they can complain, they can report to Pak Bupati directly. And yeah, the another one that Wonosobo is still what is it? Because we realize that there have been limited budget of state actors during pandemic. The new Bupati, the new region, has declared that along with human rights complaint handling tool, he will use this Wonosobo action digital tool. Actually, this is a tool for stakeholders to collaborate, to donate, and to help all the action, including human rights and SDGs program. So after some administrative transition until April, hopefully in the next May, the new region of Wonosobo, Mr. Fami Hidayat, will launch these two digital tools to make Wonosobo still comply with human rights and SDGs principle. And another one, actually, this is the new region, along with some people from Wonosobo disability community, including person with the wheelchair, Mbak Mariam Ramadhani. Actually, she is a member of regional human rights commissions, and Pak Afif himself has declared that inclusive education must be the will be prioritized after starting from 2021. So inclusive education school and enriching the two digital tool, human rights complaint handling tool and Wonosobo action with easier access for a person with disabilities. Many thanks to Mas Ichal Supriadi from Asia Democracy Network that helped me with the to encourage this effort.
Fahmi, okay. Excuse me, the time is up.
Okay, yeah, the last slide. I think this is the innovation that Wonosobo is doing today, yeah, to tackle COVID, in order to make all vulnerable groups are still okay. Local radio help people who do not possess mobile phone for online learning, and Pak Bupati himself participate in online annual planning dialogue, and this is the first time when representative from student side by side with the new Bupati. So Bupati can learn, can hear the aspiration from the students, and we have now YouTube online learning official YouTube online learning from the government of Wonosobo Regency. That's all. I would like to say that this human rights and SDGs agenda has been included in Pak Afif and Pak Albar mission. We call it Rencana Pembangunan Jangka Menengah Daerah untuk Bupati yang baru. That's all. Thank you very much and sorry for taking too much time. Kembali Mbak Windy, monggo.
It's all right. Thank you, Pak Fahmi. So we will have around 10 minutes for Q&A. The questions can be posed to either Pak Fami Hidayat or Dr. Bernadia. You may post your questions on the Q&A box, and we will try to trying to answer all of them. So please do post your questions, and we will address them accordingly. maybe to start, we could also open live questions if any of the participants would like to ask directly to our panelists.
I have a question.
Yes, please, Matt, go ahead.
Sorry, I assumed I would be visible, but thanks so much for both of these presentations this morning. The question that I continue to come back to concerns the challenges and the opportunities of multi-level governance. We have this idea of a human rights city, but as we heard from the Wonosobo example, the human rights city interacts with national level governments. I wonder if we can have a few more reflections on what kind of mechanisms you have in place to promote more coherence between these different levels. How do human rights cities interact with human rights states?
Mr. Fahmi, you may address the question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good simple question. Yeah. Since 2018, I've often proposed to people from Komnas HAM, National Human Rights Commission, for those people, those national NGO fighting for human rights and SDGs in Indonesia to help. To help people in the central government in various ministries to reformulate their direct policies so that it will comply with policies from, for instance, the National Secretariat of SDGs in Bappenas and the policies from National Human Rights Commissions. I can say that there have been problems in terms of too many silos in Indonesian policies framework. So, for instance, in my previous slide, I put some example on how the government of on how Jakarta, for instance, give instruction to all mayors and region to cut up to 20% out of their budget that they can use to develop. And we do not have a chance. We are not in a position to discuss their instruction. So on the other hand, let me tell you something that in the last since the pandemic hit Indonesia in March 2000 last year, all the local revenue are berkurang tuh apa?
Reduced.
Are all gone. Yeah. For instance, the money that we can use to fund, for instance, the basic service for education, for health, for infrastructure, are coming from the Jakarta General Allocation Fund, which is more than 75% out of all budgets. So on the other hand, for local government, for rich local government, they can still have a proper budget for development, for SDGs agenda. But in Wonosobo, because Wonosobo is popular as a tourist city, and during pandemic, we don't have any other income because tourism sectors we do not have any income from. So it is a dilemma for us to whether to comply with the Jakarta instruction or to put some local affirmative policies. If we, for instance, if we put our annual budget for SDGs and human rights agenda, then we have a problem in terms of local accounting budget or something like that.
Maybe, yeah. Maybe can I also contribute to answer this?
Ya, silahkan monggo Mbak. Mungkin Mbak Bernadia lebih paham poin saya.
Sorry, I speak in Javanese. No, thank you very much. Actually, what we would like to highlight here is enabling environment, conducive environment that central government is providing. And then we know that the role and mandates of local governments depending very much on the level of decentralizations. We cannot compare Indonesia and other countries because we have a different kind of level of decentralization. In terms of localization of SDGs, that looking at this no one left behind as a slogan, universal understanding of the implementation localization of SDGs is already included in the national framework. And it's already included with laws to implement how to integrate these SDGs into local plans. So this is definitely a very good conducive environment. And then in terms of access to funding, for example, many local governments, depending on the level of realization, depending very much on this authority and mandates to generate resources. Like for example, some countries cannot cannot have a bonds, municipal bonds, cannot have borrowing, foreign country borrowing. So there are certain limitations, and I think this is very important to understand also how the national context can be given here with human rights perspective. So we want good enabling environments, especially for local governments. So over to you, Mbak Windy.
Thank you, Ibu Dr. Bernadia and Mr. Fahmi, and for Matthew for the question. We have very limited time for this Q&A session, but we have one more question from Morten. Morten, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Good.
Yeah, can.
And thank you very much for the two opening presentations. It's very stimulating, very good to hear. I have a question for each of you, to Dr. Bernadia. I would like to ask in relation to the COVID crisis that we have been through. Thanks a lot for outlining it. Can you see a pattern of those cities that have sort of chosen to become human rights cities, that they have done better, differently than other cities? Can you, and if you have if one or two examples, it would be good to see. I mean, we definitely see it in Europe, that there are different approaches here, and I would like to hear if that is a similar pattern that you see. And Mr. Fami Hidayat, thanks again also for your presentation, really interesting, and also the figures. And as far as I understood the graphs that you showed on unemployment rates, I understood it so that for your city, for Wonosobo, the unemployment rate dropped less than in other places. Can you again give some examples of what did you do that were different from what other cities did in the same situation? So what is it that we can learn, in a way, take away from this? So once again, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Morten, Dr. Bernadia, and Mr. Fami Hidayat. We have very, very short time, so 2 to 3 minutes. So if you can answer very briefly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will be very short. Definitely, we can discuss more with to answer that questions. But I think there are already some good examples because of the technology. I mentioned about digitalization for improving of supply chains that addresses small medium enterprises, mostly benefiting the women. I think this is not in terms of human rights ordinances or human rights, legal framework, but we see that gaps can be reduced by having a good technology, number one. And then number two, also data. We see data is also cause of why this safety net program, for example, cannot be equally distributed. So I think this is why we need to, and national government depends very much on the local data. So there are already kind of examples I saw in Trenggalek region, for example, in which people who receive these safety net programs also known by everybody there. So make sure that there is no rich people get subsidy or get support with regards to several subsidies that the government is given, like not only, but it also include unemployment, support systems. So to get a new employment. So this kind of thing, I think we see this as some improvements because the government is also making sure to have one single data. And I mean, I'm talking about Indonesian case, one single data that can be applied for all. I hope this is within 3 minutes. So maybe Pak Fahmi can also elaborate more. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Morton, thank you for the question. Actually, okay, if the question is what then Wonosobo do after realize that the figure of employment rate is soaring so high? So what in a very limited time, we advocating as well for instance for small medium enterprise persons to implement the digital technology, but it takes too much time. So what the government of Wonosobo did to help the unemployed people to get their income is Mbak Windy maybe can help apa itu ya pekerjaan yang massal yang dilakukan saya lupa istilahnya mass infrastructure project. Okay. So yeah, the last year we did some project like that, so that many unemployed people from rural areas, including from village, yeah, they can work in sort of mass infrastructure project. But the problem is we cannot do this project all the time, you know. Dari segi perencanaan juga itu tidak, it doesn't make any sense. So while hoping that tourism sector recovered, what we can do is hoping that the central government province and national government province promised their last year they promised that all BLT social safety net fund will be distributed into the region, including Wonosobo. Yeah, that's the problem. I think Mbak Bernadia and Mbak Windy and many other participants, yeah, from UCLG can help me. I think all regional government have this kind of problem. Adding some new sectors for unemployed people, it's not easy. That's what we have in Wonosobo.
Thank you, Pak Fahmi. I think thank you, Dr. Bernadia, as well for both of your presentation and for being here with us. Mr. Fahmi, maybe in the next future discussion, we can discuss more about the human rights complaint handling tool. I'm very interested on that.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Bernadia and Mr. Fahmi. And now we shift to session 2 with Mas Ichal Supriadi. We'll zoom in on participation and inclusion of vulnerable communities. Mr. Ichal?
Yeah.
Yes, you have 20 minutes.
Okay. So it is privilege to be here, to seeing friends from different organizations. Special thanks for the Raoul Wallenberg Institute who hosting and organizing this event. And then, of course, pleasure to share the perspective from civil society in terms of the building back more equal human rights city framework could pave the way. I also would like to greeting a few friends who I saw in the attendees list. It is pleasure to see you, Helena, Mortens, Yuyun, and then all the names that I mentioned later. So to start with, maybe I would like to invite the somebody who holding my presentation to start displaying in the frames. Right, and then maybe next, I would like to start with the introductions of the ADNs, maybe to getting to know about ADNs, maybe just, so we are an umbrella organization of regional civil society organizations that is basically a network of networks establishing in 2013 by the key leader NGO key NGO leader in Asia. I think our role is to promote and defend democracy together, which is one of the pillars of our focus for the next 3 years, is including enhanced democracy quality. So that's why ADNs involved in the promotion of human rights cities, SDGs, and also enhancing local governments. Then our mandate is consolidate and complement regional efforts in order to promote and defend democracy together. So in these slides, you see all the regional organizations who are a member of ADN. Total, there are 10, including human rights, minorities groups, development SDGs, migrants, including the research, and then peace and conflict, including women, peace, and security. In overall across Asia and global, we have around 500 organization networks connecting with us. Next slide. So to start with my presentation, actually this presentation to respond at least 3 questions. First, how COVID has been affected the vulnerable groups, and secondly, why people participation is very important for local governments. And the third is how the local government should provide inclusive platforms to accommodating the vulnerable groups. So I would like to start my presentation by showing these declarations coming from Kathmandu Democracy Forums that held last October by ADN's partners and groups. That reports, that declarations actually reflecting the report that has been researched at least in how many countries? In 13 countries across Asia, when taking 5 thematic issues, including migrants, Dalit, disinformation, inequality, and refugees. Then this is the 3 things that I can just like extracted directly from the reports, which is mentioning how COVID impact has dimensions. The first dimension is actually about what things actually been affected badly because of the COVID-19. First is of course healthcare, economic, that related to poverty, discriminations, social security, exclusion, unemployment, and livelihood, like a food, shelters, and then education, as well as including democracy and human rights. And second dimension is like who are the most vulnerable here in terms of individuals. That include women, children, senior citizens, persons with disabilities, people in special needs, including those who are sickness. And then the third dimension is groups or majority groups that has been impacted directly by the by the COVID as the most vulnerable groups. There are migrants, refugee, Dalit, and then people with work and distance based on caste-based discriminations, stateless, prisoners, and persons who live in disaster or conflict areas. Next, please. So those are the 3 dimensions that the research has been recognized as a 3 most dimension impact to the vulnerable groups. So I'm just taking some illustration here. For example, from the report that described by our members as Global Call to Action Against Poverty. It is directly, you can read here, South Asia contains a quarter world populations, but at the same time, they also 1/3 world poor countries. So I guess it's still very reflective between South and South economic situations, despite the South Asian country contributes to the 1/4 world population, but they're still remaining 1/3 poor. The country experience, I mean, the sub-regions experience the job loss of livelihood opportunity in push, and then the group says approximately 132 million people into extreme poverty and inequalities. What happened? The impact in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia does not really impact very bad as the case of South Asia, because the region has already coped with the SARS that happened in 2013, and then a few have long established economic strength like Singapore and Thailand. And then I try to bring another illustration, the impact number 2 that happening with DWD, caste group, and interconnected with migrants and refugees. You can see who are people living in very suppressive caste groups. Maybe for some of friends who are never follows the situation of DWD and caste group, you will see millions people under discrimination, living under serious distance and working conditions are actually suppressed in South Asia. Not only in South Asia, but also including Japan, Malaysia, and also in Yemen. We still have a caste who living under separations. And then discrimination in terms of the education, social, economic, political, cultural, and also educations. So for them, the COVID-19 lockdown caused economic pains, badly exposed to the immediate risk of hunger, starvation, stunting, malnourishment. And of course, many of them experienced violence and atrocities during pandemic because of the social prejudice and also violence against the communities. In rapes and sexual violence has been increased because they contained in one community and cannot move. Maybe next. That has been reported by our member, Asia Dalit Right Forums, based in New Delhi. And then another illustration here, I put like informal employment in South Asia, at least I describe here. You can see the situations of informal employments in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Then the COVID directly impacted the income, to the security of food, and every single things that I described early in the previous slides. This is also reported by Asia Dalit Rights. What about migrants? I think the same, almost same conditions, because many of the migrants that migrating in neighboring countries or overseas, they work as temporary, informal, unprotected. They have low wage and lack of social protections. So when the country enforced lockdown, they don't have much choice. Unless they lay off, working condition reduction, non-payment of wage, cram, because they has been contained in one place, cram in inadequate living conditions, and movement restriction or forced to returns, where when they returns, they've been stigmatized. The courts or people who bringing the COVID to the national fellows. And also for refugee, is even worse situation because they're living without limited freedoms. They don't have right to move. They have denial access to basic needs, access to health care, live in very dense packed camps. If you can see how the situation in Rohingya camps, or they're living without hygiene and sanitary, and of course they cannot go anywhere. They have to really depend on the food that they're supplied by volunteers of the UN's refugee group who are cooking for them, or they have to finding their own food. And some, for example, in Kashmir, the many refugees living in detention, torture, and internet blackouts. No protection and security. Harassment happens in many places and many corners of refugee camps. Maybe next. So that is the just illustrations of very few slides that I described is the situation happening in many corners of the groups that happenings. That also happens in many corners of the villages of the countries. Doesn't matter where it is the countries, but mostly women, elders, minorities, the sickness, person with disabilities is likely having similar impacts. And then when we're looking at the general response from the government, so I put in here two response. First, by the governments that normally they always denials if this COVID coming in. And then when they realize they respond with very chaotic situation, they underestimate, underprepared, and then obviously disorganized and bureaucracy. I think Mr. Fahmi has just confirmed how the policy or instructions from the central government is likely chaotic and contradict with one to another. And then of course, the government in different countries, they have to face of the inadequacy healthcare systems and infrastructures. And of course, finance also play a very important role in handling the success of handling of COVID. Lockdown first, ignore consequences. It's happened in many countries around the world, including in Asia. Maybe some time ago, we read some articles where Indian migrant workers have to walking 100 kilometers just to reach home because suddenly the government shut down the transportation. They cannot go home. At the same time, they cannot leave and staying in capital because they cannot just simply find a job or find a food for survival. And of course, again, discriminative, corruptions, and business oriented that has been played along the suffer of COVID in many aspects of national governments, provincials, and even local governments. And the worst is if the government play politics around the COVID suffers. In different sites, the NGO and private sectors is likely, has been agreed by many aspects of the research, they're able to reach the vulnerable group faster and even more efficient. You can find in any kind of report that indicated that the civil society, private sectors are always able to reach the victims, the people who suffer even before the government. And then they're doing this as a self-initiative or community initiative. And then they also able to survival by help each other. And then of course, based on voluntarism. The government coming letters with so many regulations, so many pact, and so many enforcements, and then restriction, etc. So I think that is the very contrast at the very beginning, how to respond to COVID. But of course, right now, government started taking control and then try to regulate things wisely at the moment. Why local participation is important? I think, no doubt, the local can best identify solutions based on their need and then timely according to what they likely efficient for them. And then know the information and handle handling problem like disinformation, stigmatization, structural barriers, content and traces, etc. The local participations and then the vulnerable groups knows very well about that. And then devise collective responses based on the structural society structures and addressing every single concern from different community. And then of course, less bureaucracy, because they can pinpoint directly every single aspect they want to expect for the communities. And then this routine will automatically enhance community resilience. There will be buildings, trust, and then building understandings, tolerance, and then very dynamic interaction in the very local levels. Next slide, next slide. And then if you're asking what can be done by the governments to initiate or to enhancing cooperations or with the vulnerable group, I think there's a few combinations based on our perspective. First is to build or promote a culture of solidarity first, to build the trust and then show the kindness to the vulnerable group. It's not about politics, it's not about the budget, but again, how the government sincerely showing the sympathy and then the solidarity to the vulnerable group. And once the trust is built, that obviously can be reducing the gaps. And secondly, the government can provide empowerments and guidance to ensure the community can act without fears. Many governments across Asia demonstrating threats. If you cannot lock down, then I'll beat you up. I will arrest you. Or if you don't do vaccinations, I will do this, I will do that. It's more threat than the educations. I know it's not really representing so many cases in different countries, but at least from what we heard, more threat than educations. Number three, utilize available platforms, kind of like SDG, Human Rights City, and many other platforms that can be approached by the governments in order to build or to help the vulnerable groups. And then promote cooperations and respond the problems. Every single initiative the governments should be targeted to respond the problem rather than just showing I care about you, but never respond to problems. And some step that can be considered in the coming future is you have to try to communicate clearly about the risk involved. That is part of educations that governments should address to the peoples. And then consistently highlight the role of social responsibility that plays during a pandemics. And then that can encourage citizen participation to assess then their own needs. And then CSO and community leaders can be used, can help the governments, can be approached as a bridge and promoters in order to build meaningful intervention or meaningful support to the vulnerable groups. Adapt and adopt. Adapt what they really want and adopt everything necessary to end the people, the vulnerable groups suffer as soon as possible. And then you have to be able to seal some things around the regulations. Somehow, although it's not regulated yet, but the government, the local government can play around what it is not said in the regulations, which is not stopping them to do, then they have to do. So sometimes to making regulation takes sometimes, taking even more times. But the government no need to wait for regulation to act to saving vulnerable groups. And of course, budget is always be a problem. So that's why government should be able, like what Fahmi said yesterday, just now, he always in dilemma, which sector need to be prioritized. But for me, saving life and then end up or reducing suffer for the vulnerable group, it could be priority. And of course, NGO and think tank could benefit the process as well. So I don't know, I think my time is end up, and then that is my interventions. We can explore more in the Q&A. Thank you so much, and return to you, Windy.
Thank you, Mas Ichal. We quickly shift to Matt for the last session. Hi, Matt. You have approximately 20 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Okay, no problem. Let me just, I'm in control of my screen, so I'll share it in just a second. Yeah, I think we're there. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you this morning from Sweden. Thank you so much already to the speakers who've come before me. Now it feels like my screen is frozen. Windy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear and see your screen actually, but it's stopped.
Okay.
No.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
It feels a bit, yeah, I'll try. Just give me a signal if it breaks up. Maybe it was a brief delay.
Sure.
So it's a pleasure to be here. It's morning in Sweden and it's beautiful. I hope it's the same where you are in Indonesia or in Thailand or other parts of the region. What I'd like to do, it's a bit more of a conceptual presentation compared with earlier presentations that have focused on specific facts from places like Wonosobo. But what I'd like to do is try to frame this idea of pandemic preparedness and response. I think a lot of the discussion that we have around COVID-19 relates to response more than it does to the preparedness aspect. So what I'd like to do in this talk is try to frame this concept of pandemic preparedness and response from a human rights perspective. And since we are in this event focusing on human rights cities, I'd like to try to target the municipal level of this kind of an approach. So I'll do this by first talking about what this human rights perspective is and why we need it, before highlighting some of the aspects that could be considered to make up a pandemic preparedness and response framework, and then zoom in on the municipal level before setting out a very brief kind of agenda. And I think the important starting point is to highlight the need for deepening our understanding of what has worked and what hasn't worked and what has even gone wrong in the context of responding to COVID-19. It's an important learning opportunity so that we can have this experience of building forward better and taking that idea as the core of the initiative moving forward in 2021. So, but why human rights? I mean, of course, we have a panel today talking about human rights cities. So there's clearly institutional recognition of the importance of human rights at the city level. But it's particularly relevant in the context of pandemic preparedness and response. We can see this both from the underlying principles of international human rights law, as well as the core principles underpinning the post-2015 development agenda reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, the new urban agenda, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and other parts of this post-2015 framework. The core point from international human rights law is that the responsibility for protecting populations lies with the state. This is the core element of human rights law. But of course, that means not only the state at the national level, but also at the municipality level. And this is partly where the human rights cities idea comes in, that even at the local level, the authorities have a responsibility to protect all people within their jurisdiction without discrimination. And what we see in the context of COVID-19, as well as in other disaster situations, is that failures of preparedness can have adverse human rights impacts, and responses themselves can have adverse human rights impacts, particularly if they're not informed by the considerations that come from the adoption of a human rights-based approach, when they don't take into account the situation of persons with disabilities, differential economic experiences where, for instance, in lockdown, people have a difficulty carrying out labor activities, getting food, getting water, getting healthcare. So both from the failure to act as well as the act itself, there can be adverse human rights consequences. So we need to adopt this human rights perspective. Pointing again to the post-2015 frameworks, all of these expressly adopt a human rights-based approach. So where in pretty much all countries we have an enthusiastic endorsement of the Sustainable Development Goals, it follows that there should be an enthusiastic endorsement of a human rights-based approach. It's called for expressly in Agenda 2030. It's called for expressly in the New Urban Agenda. And as I said, this is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction as well. But now some might say, aren't we done with COVID yet? Well, we're certainly not in terms of the realities on the ground in many countries. Here in Sweden, we have talk of a third wave. In other countries, the pandemic continues to rage. And of course, the economic impacts, as we heard from Ichal Supriadi earlier, is devastating. The slide on the image on the left shows from the World Bank the estimates of the number of people who have been pushed into extreme poverty since the start of the pandemic, with an additional 88 million people falling into that category of extreme deprivation. So that has long-term implications for human development and for the enjoyment of human rights. So for that reason alone, we should be thinking about a human rights-based response to the pandemic and its consequences. But we must also remember that this is unlikely to be the last pandemic that we have to deal with. We heard already about the benefits that some countries in Southeast Asia experienced from having the experience already in 2003 of the SARS epidemic. So there's some learning that's happened in those places. But looking forward, we can expect further pandemic risk to characterize life in the early Anthropocene. This image to the right highlights this. It's from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Index, which puts infectious disease pretty much parallel with climate action failure as those kinds of risks that are both most likely to occur and to have the most significant adverse impacts. There's many other risks. All of these are also high risk and high likelihood. But pandemic disease is prominent. So we need to be thinking about this moving forward. And that's why that idea of preparedness is so important, because this is unlikely to be the last round of the experience. So when we're thinking about preparedness from a human rights perspective, it can be helpful to have a bit of a conceptual framework. This framework isn't the only one around, but it's one that we've been working with at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in different projects, both on disaster displacement in Asia and the Pacific, as well as in the context of that 14-country study on national legal and policy responses to COVID-19 that Wendy mentioned in the introduction this morning. The conceptual framework that you can see here derives from the 2003 UN Common Understanding on a human rights-based approach, but we've adapted it a little bit to make it more user-friendly. You do see a lot of boxes here, which might be overwhelming, but the four core elements here are governance aspects, procedural aspects, substantive aspects, and this core non-discrimination and equality element. And the way that I tend to talk about this approach and its benefit is that it provides a way of thinking about social organization and the role of different actors within different contexts, and what kinds of issues need to be addressed that can sometimes be overlooked. So it's not a question of replacing existing frameworks or structures with a human rights-based approach, but you can imagine it more as something you lay over the top of existing processes and structures and arrangements so that you can see what might not be considered in a particular space. So if it's health preparedness at the local level, there might be consideration of persons with disabilities, a gender aspect, etc. But what about some of those other groups that Ichal was talking about earlier? Dalit communities, stateless people, people in situations of irregular migration, migrant workers, and so on. It helps to see gaps, and I think that's an important contribution of the approach. When we zoom into the specific application in the context of pandemic preparedness and response, I refer to the UN Secretary General's framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19, which was published at the very start of the pandemic. This is a framework that pulls together key human rights considerations relevant to the pandemic. And it's a framework that we used in that 14-country study that Wendy mentioned. We can probably put a link to that study in the chat later on. But these 9 circles you can see on the screen are some of those areas that are clearly adversely impacted when it comes to the pandemic. And these are, of course, then the kinds of issues that, whether at the national level, the municipal level, or the village level, need to be taken into account moving forward, thinking about how to prepare for the next pandemic, but also how to deal with the adverse impacts that we're seeing and that we've heard described in the earlier presentations today. So things like vulnerability and discrimination, which we heard quite a lot about just now, the right to health, the exposure, the increasing exposure to violence, as we've also heard about. We heard in the Wonosobo example about initiatives to promote access to information. People who don't have access to digital technologies might need other ways of getting access. How do we think about reaching people who may not speak majority languages or people with sensory disabilities? Again, this is emphasizing the kinds of questions that a human rights-based approach helps us to identify as being relevant in any kind of situation. I won't go into all of them for the sake of time. The other point that's important to emphasize, and that comes out of, amongst others, the post-2015 development agenda and those frameworks that I mentioned, the new urban agenda, the Sendai framework, is this emphasis on multi-level, multi-stakeholder, and multi-sectoral approaches. So it's not just the Ministry of Health or the local health department that's responsible for dealing with pandemic preparedness and response, but it's these kinds of whole of society, whole of government approaches that really need to be strengthened so that the left hand knows what the right hand is thinking. And when we're trying to promote better preparedness. It's not in one small silo, as we heard described earlier, but it's more comprehensive. And that's easy to say sitting in academic context in Sweden. It's a totally different thing when we're at the local level in Jakarta or Bangkok or smaller cities in the region or other parts of the world. And that's why it really is a question about bringing these actors together to discuss how some of these issues can be addressed collaboratively and constructively. And the human rights-based approach that's presented here doesn't offer all of the answers, but I think it does offer some important questions. So when we get to that municipality level, we also see a bit more of the complexity, because it's not even a question here of a single city having a single solution to the complexity of pandemic risk, but we have different levels within a municipal context. And so again, we need to be able to drill down and appreciate that complexity. One of those points that we heard from the earlier speaker from the United Cities and Local Government emphasized the importance of data in this context. How do we reach people who are in situations of vulnerability if we don't know who they are? And again, from a preparedness point of view, we need to be thinking about that before the pandemic unfolds, because once it's already underway, it can be much more difficult. So a kind of mapping of different people in situations of vulnerability is something that's called for already under the Sendai framework and is carried out by disaster management agencies and offices at the local level in many parts of the world. Integrating pandemic thinking into those local risk management exercises is one way forward. If I can start to come to a close, I just wanted to emphasize how this framework here, which I've condensed into those 4 elements, how the human rights-based approach actually asks specific questions when it comes to pandemic preparedness and response. I don't know about you, but I can't read that. And I'm not sure why it hasn't loaded well enough, but there it comes. So when we think about the substantive element of the human rights-based approach and how that applies in a municipal level in the context of pandemic preparedness and response, we think, for instance, not only how do people get access to water, how do they get access to food, how do they ensure the enjoyment of the right to work, the right to education, but we break it down into more elements that refine our perspective by asking about affordability, acceptability, quality of these kinds of measures, so that there's a reference to existing standards and guidelines that can help us to think about what's needed in different contexts. A point that was emphasized in the last presentation around participation, I think I can only echo. When we're dealing with the pandemic and trying to develop ways of building forward better, participation has to be central. And it starts by learning from experiences of COVID-19 in their many different forms. What's worked, what hasn't worked, and why? The question we heard from Morten about what have human rights cities done that have improved or contributed to better outcomes compared to other places that have adopted different approaches. We can learn from that, and there's clearly further research that could be done in that space. But it's not just a matter of collecting insights, but also of then engaging different people who are often marginalized in the decision-making process So not just filling out a form and then letting the typical decision makers take over, but developing mechanisms for active, inclusive, and meaningful participation at the local, subnational, and national levels is really important. I think I'm running pretty much out of time, so I'll jump to the very last slide, which is about the agenda moving forward. And it's super easy because it's not offering any answers or any quick toolkits or anything like that, although we do have and have used different toolkits in trying to understand some of the issues related to the pandemic. But moving forward, there's clearly a need for further research, further education, and for more direct engagement on these kinds of issues. And I think this forum that we have today is a great opportunity, and I hope we have more of them. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, for your very interesting presentation. Now we have about 27 minutes for question and answers. I believe I have one here. Hang on, let me see. Oh, we actually have a question from Sarah Hoflich. Well, Ichal has provided some answers, but let me just throw this to the other panelists as well. Or Sarah, do you want to ask your question to the other panelists as well? Or can I just read it? Sarah?
Oh, yes. Hello.
Yes.
From
hello.
Barcelona. If you prefer, you can read it. I was just, for us, the point on participation and also the way how the human rights agenda can inspire is intimately aligned with the local democracy. So if sometimes people speak about the government, it sounds like that all the governments will respond equally, but actually if we have a situation of more or less decentralization, then if we have local government leaders, elected leaders, they report back to their citizens. They are more transparent and accountable, ideally, of course, but they have, of course, other opportunity to tackle inequality, which is now we can see from UCLG World Secretariat where I work, we do now really a big review of inequality because we see that this is increasing during the pandemic, despite, of course, more awareness and of this emergency agenda. And the opportunity in emergency to see it. But however, if we want a long-term stable process, the way how local democracy is established is fundamental for giving local leaders the duty and the opportunity to report back. And of course, if you have a strong local government with more functions, with more possibilities, then the proactive approach, for example, to do programs such as those who were now reported by Wonosobo and also by Mr. Supriadi or the last, then it is different. So it is very important that we do the link between accountability, transparency, and with the local democracy. And there is my question for those who research and know well the different Asian countries and local government possibilities and opportunity, if you can see that there is a difference. So if it is two fights, the human right approach for all government, or if it's and local democracy separated, or is it is one, that we need, that automatically more participation, more rights, more inclusion needs stronger local democracy? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. If I can just also jump in with my question, so then we can just address them together. This is directed to Pak Fahmi, because I'm quite interested about how Wonosobo approach human rights city. Because I'm looking at the Wonosobo's bylaw on human rights regency. I'm sorry that it's in Bahasa Indonesia, or else I could just share it with you guys. But one of the scope or aspects that this bylaw is focusing on is about participation. My question is about, well, since it is in the bylaw and Wonosobo has quite a sustainable way of doing human rights city, especially through bylaw, one of which is through bylaw. How have the Wonosobo government then ensure public participation remain active and integrated into city's response to pandemic so far? I'm particularly interested about the complaint tool earlier shared. I would like to know a bit more about that. Is it there, or is in the pipeline, and how the Wonosobo's government approach this complaint handling tool? That would be quite interesting to know, because we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are currently developing a handbook on localizing human rights, and one of the aspects, the main aspects of this handbook is to ensure participation. We are trying to find what works, and Wonosobo's experience could be one of the useful information that we could see to enrich our discussion on developing this handbook. So that's my question to Mr. Fami. Thank you. Hang on, sorry. Just one more question. I have one more question from Singgi Nugroho. I believe Pak Singgi is also one of our alumni. So his question is, I would like to know about the best practices of the government and local CSOs in some Asian countries in fulfilling basic rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. How to manage the challenge in the health and economy, education, and raise social capital. A crisis is a strategic momentum for political leaders at the local level to show their leadership in passing through these times of crisis. So that's, I believe all the remaining panelists could answer this. So we can start, maybe we can start with Pak Fahmi and then Ichal and Matt.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Windy. Yeah, I read the question from Sarah. Yeah, appointed versus elected. In the case of Wonosobo, as we know that all the mayor, all the region are today elected. So yes, in my opinion, based on Wonosobo experience, after a region inaugurated after the election, then they have to make some promise. The promise derived from the strategic planning document. They have to pay attention to the promise they made during the campaign. In my opinion, all the questions and all the promises that they have talked to people during the campaign must be first addressed. And for instance, in the case of Wonosobo, during the campaign, Pak Afif and Pak Albar have declared that if we want to build all the poor road in Wonosobo, will be developed into a better condition. But on the other hand, I can calculate that the budget that Wonosobo has today is not adequate, it's not enough to do so. Maksudnya Mbak Windy, that is the first problem, and that's why probably the problem is not whether they elected or they appointed, because once they inaugurated into a new region, then they must work under the constitution, under the framework. They have the key performance indicator to succeed. Then they have the minimum standard SPM requirement standard to comply, something like that. Yeah, probably the situation will be different comparing to be compared from a region or city like Wonosobo with the region or city with the local with the bigger local income, pendapatan asli daerah, tahu Mbak?
Yeah, local income.
Yeah, local income.
Revenue.
So, local revenue. 3 years ago, when I visited Bojonegoro, for instance, Bojonegoro, annually they have the revenue from oil, cepu, bagi hasil minyak, revenue from oil revenue from the national government, and then distributed into the local government from the location. I mean, Bojonegoro have annually they have around 600 billion rupiah. What I'm trying to say is that the total amount of Wonosobo has, compared to the additional revenue that Bojonegoro has only from oil, is only the total budget for Wonosobo is only half compared to the additional revenue from Bojonegoro. And I would say that money is not everything, but if a leader have more money, I think it's easier for them to pay the promise during the campaigns. That's the point. Yeah. And another question from Mbak Windy. Yeah. The human rights complaint handling tool will not answer all the questions, but I think it is at least the best way for us to make sure that the vulnerable groups will always be heard. Yeah, because the practical situation after the central government instructed all regions to do some annual budget refocusing is that, for instance, money from the education sector must be cut around 20 to 30%. In Wonosobo, before pandemic, we have planned to carry out the inclusive schools. And yeah, I have to honestly, I have to say that it is a big, it is very dangerous for us, for the government of Wonosobo, if the trend of budget cut from the central government will continue until 2002, until the next 2 years, because it is difficult for the new region of Wonosobo to keep the promise to implement the inclusive education program. For instance, we can use this example in education sector into other sectors such as health, such as sanitation, such as anti-stunting program or something like that. So in my simple opinion, by practicing and by implementing human rights complaint handling tool at one side, and by promoting Wonosobo actions, so we can help, so we can gain more resources, final resources, including from Wonosobo diaspora. And hopefully it will help Wonosobo to sustain the previous condition before pandemic. Gitu Mbak, kira-kira.
Thank you, Pak Fami. Maybe we can move to Ichal and then Matt.
Yeah, so there are a few questions over there. Maybe just a little bit to clarify what I said for the elected or appointed officer, because a person is matter, because what we witness the success stories of the Wonosobo is actually a a good man's realizing some things, and then he able to deliver, translated to the documents and get support from the bureaucracy. Pak Fahmi is a one vivid evidence who are the leaders able to deliver some things to the bureaucracy, and then this a good person's realize if his terms will not be forever, and then immediately translated the ideas, the initiative to seal the deal into the local regulations. That's the one who assure the sustainability forwards, because I know when Pak Fahmi was referred to Bojonegoro regions, I mean, so many region or city in Indonesia try to pick up human rights city concept, but then again mainly fails because they are unable to seal on the local regulations. So the next leaders will abandon this initiative. So that is really referred to the how one man can really matters and can affect the policy, and then brings change to the human right and democracy situation within the regions. In many countries in Asia, somehow elected officer is underperformance, because especially those who are just elected without skills, without experience, just because he can collect more votes and then he's in the position as a leader. But COVID is really something, that really requires a preparation, just like what Dr. Matthew said, mitigating, respond to problems, and financial ability, transparency, participation, so many components that we can list down along the road to the success, to the response. At the same time,
Fami, if you may, yes,
can also play instruction if the national government's the central government instruction is really comprehensive, really accurate, and really very efficient to addressing the problem at the local level. So for me, doesn't matter about elected or appointed, it's depending how you able to mitigating and responding, including financial ability, transparency, healthcare system, etc., etc. I also read one of question from Singgi. Should I respond right now, because it's take very long comparisons in Asia? Then I guess I will respond if we still have next rounds opportunity. Maybe I just give a time to Dr. Matthew. Over to you, Windy.
Yes, please, Matt.
Thanks. I just have short reflections. I think that first question about the interrelationship between local democracy and human rights cities, without wading too much into it, a kind of human rights perspective, in my view, suggests that the system of government doesn't necessarily affect the enjoyment of human rights. In principle, whatever system of government is in place should be able to fulfill that core duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So whether it's a centralized system or a decentralized system shouldn't be determinative of the level of enjoyment of human rights. But states have that duty within whatever system they have to achieve those obligations that they've agreed to be bound by under international human rights law. One of those obligations, though, of course, is the right of people to participate in government. And so it may be difficult to achieve that in a highly centralized system, but probably making a strict dichotomy between centralized and decentralized misses all of the nuances that can happen in different parts of Asia or the rest of the world. And in this sense, maybe thinking about the contribution that can be made by these post-2015 international frameworks, the Sendai framework, the New Urban Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, all of these are quite enthusiastically adopted by states and local governments. And here I think you can possibly see the seeds for new forms of organization coming up, where leaving no one behind and where these ideas of multi-level, multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral governance are emphasized. There can be some basis for finding ways, if they don't already exist, to enhance that coherence between different levels of government. And not forgetting within that framework, international standards, as well as the voices of people at the very bottom of society. So if there's one thing to be said for these post-2015 frameworks, it's that idea of promoting that integrated communication where people aren't left behind, which they often are. The only other point I'd make in that context is where you do see reference to participation in national legal and policy documents on disaster risk reduction and other documents, it tends to generalize the community. And this is something where further work could be done to highlight that this is not one single entity, the community, but rather, as we heard from Ichal and others, there are a variety of people with intersecting identities at the local level whose perspectives are often not heard because of exclusion and marginalization, either owing to social or legal factors. So I think taking one major point away is the need to really work very hard on participation at these different levels. I don't think there's an easy mechanism for that, but I encourage the work that's being initiated here.
Thank you, Matt. We have approximately 5 more minutes. So if Ichal can answer the question earlier from Pa Sugeng, and then we will wrap up. Thank you.
Singgi,
right?
Sorry. Well, I try to think and try to remember from the report, is there any very efficient mechanisms based on human rights approach? Of course, we can refer to Taiwan's or to South Korea, where the government respond. In Asia, we can refer to Taiwan and South Korea, where the government providing enough recognitions when there's a recognition transparency for the first stage of when the when the cases happens in their country, and even the sending research teams to understand, providing very good, very excellent communication information to the public. They impose the IT systems to track, and then of course they're having few time lockdowns, but they're providing ample mechanism to ensure the rights. But people may argue South Korea and Taiwan is very close and very tiny community, and of course they have economic ability to handling the first wave of the COVID, which is not the case of many. And then many analysts also say the China examples with suppressive action is very efficient to manage a larger community or larger populations, which is, of course, not the case, not the ideal example for the civil society and human rights advocates. So it's truly, there is no examples that we can adopt, but depending of, I mean, there is no models that really can be, you know, compare apple to apples, because every country have very unique and distinct challenges in terms of the social economics and of course geographics as well. So, but I think we can refer Taiwan's and South Korea at the moment of times, while the rest we still figuring out there's a lot of lackings in terms of the respect for human rights and democracy principles. I think that's perhaps can make a very quick response on that question. Thank you so much. Over back to you, Wendy.
Yes, thank you, Ichal. Okay, we've received some thanks from the participants of the interesting answers and very useful information. And we are very close to the time. Now we only have 2 minutes more. So this is just to wrap up that. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. It's been a very, very interesting discussion. We have experiences from local governments, from Wonosobo, which I found very interesting, and from Ichal and Matt as well. And I would like to thank our colleagues from UCLG as well for being actively participating in this event. And thank you again. And I hope we are all in the healthy condition, and hope everyone's staying safe. And if you have any further questions that you want to ask to either the panelists or to RWI, please do send, drop us an email. My email, for example, is in the flyer. You can ask us questions, and we will try as much as possible to respond. If you want for more information about human rights cities, you can go to our website, rwi.or.id or rwi.lu.se. We have done few research and reports on human rights city, which can help further understanding about human rights city, not just in Asia Pacific, but generally in the several other areas in the world. And with that, I would like to say goodbye to you all. Until next time. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Windy, Matthew, Fami.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.